Chapter 1: The Garage Gamble. In the spring of 1976, in a quiet suburb of Los Altos, California, two young men sat in a cramped garage surrounded by circuit boards, wires, and the smell of solder. One was a soft-spoken engineering genius named Steve Wozniak. The other was a barefoot, intense 21-year-old college dropout who believed he could change the world. His name was Steve Jobs. Together, they had founded a company they called Apple Computer. The starting capital was almost nothing. Jobs sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his beloved Hewlett-Packard calculator. Between them, they scraped together roughly $1,000. There were no investors, no offices, no safety net. There was only an idea that ordinary people, not just corporations and governments, deserved a computer of their own. Jobs had been an unlikely candidate for greatness. Adopted as an infant, he grew up in what would later become Silicon Valley, tinkering with electronics alongside his adoptive father in their family garage. He dropped out of Reed College after just one semester, unwilling to drain his parents' savings. But he kept attending classes that fascinated him, including a calligraphy course that, years later, would shape the elegant typography of every Macintosh computer. Their first product, the Apple I, was little more than a bare circuit board. A local shop called the Byte Shop ordered 50 units at $500 each. Jobs and Wozniak had no money to buy parts, so Jobs talked a supplier into giving them components on 30 days' credit. They built the machines by hand, often working through the night, and delivered them just in time to get paid. It was a razor-thin operation, surviving paycheck to paycheck, order to order. But Jobs saw something Wozniak's brilliant circuits could not provide on their own. He saw destiny. While Wozniak obsessed over engineering, Jobs obsessed over the bigger picture. He wanted Apple to be a real company, with real ambition. He pushed, he prodded, he demanded more. To those around him, his confidence bordered on arrogance. Yet there was a magnetic, almost hypnotic quality to the way he spoke about the future. People who started out doubting him often walked away believing. By the end of 1976, the two founders knew the Apple I was just a beginning. Wozniak was already designing something far more powerful, a machine that could display color, plug into a keyboard, and feel like a finished product rather than a hobbyist's kit. But to build it and sell it to the masses, they would need something the garage could never provide: money, and lots of it. The dream that had begun with $1,000 and a sold van was about to collide with the cold reality of business, and Steve Jobs, the dropout with nothing to lose, was about to make his first great gamble, one that would either launch an empire or end it before it began. Chapter 2: The Machine That Changed Everything. To turn Apple into more than a garage operation, Jobs went hunting for capital and credibility. He found both in a man named Mike Markkula, a former Intel executive who had retired wealthy in his early 30s. Markkula saw the potential in these two scrappy founders and invested $92,000 of his own money while helping secure a line of credit. With that backing, Apple Computer became a real corporation in January 1977. Now they had the resources to launch Wozniak's masterpiece, the Apple II. When it debuted at the West Coast Computer Fair in 1977, it stunned the industry. Housed in a sleek plastic case, capable of displaying color graphics and ready to use right out of the box, it didn't look like a machine for hobbyists. It looked like the future. Jobs had insisted on every detail, from the design of the case to the quiet operation without a noisy cooling fan. He understood something most engineers missed. People didn't just want technology. They wanted technology that felt human, approachable, even beautiful. The Apple II became one of the most successful products of its era. Then came the killer application. A program called VisiCalc, the first electronic spreadsheet, ran exclusively on the Apple II at launch. Suddenly, businesses had a concrete reason to buy the machine. Sales exploded. Apple was selling tens of thousands of units, then hundreds of thousands. Revenue climbed from a few $1,000,000 into the tens of millions, and then beyond. By the end of the decade, Apple had grown from a two-man garage startup into one of the fastest-growing companies in American history. On December 12, 1980, Apple went public. The initial public offering instantly created hundreds of millionaires, more than any company since Ford decades earlier. Steve Jobs, just 25 years old, was suddenly worth over $200 million on paper. He had achieved the kind of wealth most people couldn't imagine, and he had done it before turning 26. But money was never the point for Jobs. He famously said, "Being the richest man in the cemetery doesn't matter to me. Going to bed at night saying we've done something wonderful, that's what matters to me." Yet success brought new dangers. Apple was no longer a tiny rebel. It was a giant, and giants attract giants. IBM, the most powerful technology company on Earth, was watching closely. In 1981, IBM launched its own personal computer, and the entire industry shifted overnight. The cozy world Jobs had helped create was now a battlefield. To survive, Apple needed something revolutionary, a machine so advanced, so different, that it could redefine what a computer even was. Jobs threw himself into a secret project that would consume him entirely. It would become either his greatest triumph or the beginning of his undoing. He called it the Macintosh. Chapter 3: The Bet on the Macintosh. Steve Jobs had visited the future, and he could not unsee it. In 1979, he toured Xerox's research center in Palo Alto, where engineers had created something extraordinary, a computer you controlled not with cryptic typed commands, but with a small device that moved a pointer across the screen. A mouse, icons, windows, a graphical world anyone could understand at a glance. Most people who saw it shrugged. Jobs understood instantly that this would change everything. He poured that vision into the Macintosh, a project he seized control of and drove with relentless, almost punishing intensity. He demanded the impossible from his team, pushing them through grueling hours and impossible deadlines. He could be brutal, dismissing work as garbage one moment and praising it as brilliant the next. Engineers called the phenomenon his reality distortion field, his uncanny ability to convince people they could achieve things they believed were impossible. And somehow, again and again they did. Jobs believed the Macintosh had to be perfect, inside and out. He insisted that even the circuit board hidden inside the case be beautifully arranged, because as his adoptive father had taught him, a true craftsman cares about the parts no one will ever see. He wanted the computer to feel friendly, so it greeted users with a simple hello on the screen. Every font, every pixel, every rounded corner was agonized over. On January 22, 1984, Apple bet its reputation on a single 60-second television commercial. Directed by Ridley Scott and aired during the Super Bowl, the ad depicted a dystopian world of gray, mindless conformity, shattered by a single rebel hurling a hammer through a giant screen. It never showed the product. It simply promised that on January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. It became one of the most famous commercials ever made. 2 days later, Jobs stepped onto a stage before a roaring crowd. He pulled the Macintosh from a bag, and the little machine spoke for itself, displaying graphics and text no affordable computer had ever shown. The audience erupted. For a moment, Jobs stood at the summit of the technology world, but beneath the triumph, trouble was brewing. The Macintosh was revolutionary, but it was also expensive, nearly $2,500, and slower than customers expected. He just didn't know yet which of his two struggling companies would crack open the door, or that the company that had cast him out would one day come crawling back to beg for his return. Chapter 5: The Greatest Comeback in Business History. The first miracle came from the place no one expected. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first feature film made entirely with computer animation. It was a massive gamble, the product of years of struggle and Jobs' relentless funding. The film became a global sensation, earning over $360 million worldwide. Just days after its release, Pixar went public. Steve Jobs, who had poured a fortune into the company and weathered years of doubt, suddenly held a stake worth more than $1 billion. The has-been was a billionaire again. Meanwhile, the company that had exiled him was collapsing. Without Jobs' vision, Apple had drifted. It flooded the market with confusing products, lost its identity, and bled money. By 1996, Apple was reportedly within months of bankruptcy. Desperate for a future operating system, Apple's leadership looked around and turned to Next, the company Jobs had built in exile. In December 1996, Apple announced it would acquire Next for over $400 million. The deal brought Next's advanced technology into Apple. It also brought back Steve Jobs. The prodigal founder had returned to the kingdom that cast him out. By 1997, with Apple still spiraling, Jobs was named interim CEO. What followed became legend. He ruthlessly slashed Apple's bloated product line, cutting dozens of projects down to a handful of focused products. He struck a stunning deal with Microsoft, his old rival, securing a $150 million investment to stabilize the company. And he reignited Apple's soul with a defiant new advertising campaign that captured his entire philosophy in 2 words: think different. Then came the products that would resurrect the empire. In 1998, the iMac, a colorful, translucent, all-in-one computer, became a runaway hit and signaled Apple was alive again. But the real revolution arrived in 2001. Apple unveiled the iPod, a sleek device that could hold 1,000 songs in your pocket, paired with the iTunes Store that transformed how the world bought music. Jobs had once again found the intersection of technology and human desire. Apple was no longer just surviving, it was thriving, defining culture, and building towards something even bigger. Through it all, Jobs operated by a principle he stated plainly: innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. He didn't ask customers what they wanted. He showed them what they didn't yet know they needed. The man who had been humiliated and discarded was now undeniably back at the height of his powers, sharper, wiser, and more disciplined than the impulsive young founder of the early days. But his most world-changing creation was still ahead. In a guarded laboratory, a small team was working in total secrecy on a device that would not just save Apple, it would reshape human civilization itself. And in 2007, Steve Jobs would walk onto a stage and change everything again. Chapter 6: The Device That Built a $1 Trillion Empire. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs stood before a packed auditorium in San Francisco and told the crowd he would introduce 3 revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod, a mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet device. Then he repeated them slowly until the audience understood. These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone. The room exploded. In that single moment, Jobs unveiled a machine that would transform how billions of people live, work, and connect. The iPhone erased the line between computer and phone, between digital and daily life. It launched an entire ecosystem, the App Store, a new economy built on millions of applications, putting the power of a computer in nearly every pocket on Earth. Apple's growth became staggering. The company that had nearly gone bankrupt a decade earlier became one of the most valuable corporations in human history. iPhones sold by the hundreds of millions. Apple's revenue soared into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The garage startup founded on $1,000 had become a global empire. But as Apple ascended, Steve Jobs was waging a private battle. In 2003, he had been diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. For years, he fought it while continuing to lead the company, growing visibly thinner, yet still walking onto stages to unveil the iPad and new generations of devices that reshaped entire industries. In 2005, before the world knew the full extent of his illness, Jobs delivered a commencement speech at Stanford University that became one of the most watched in history. He spoke about death not with fear, but with clarity. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. And he left the graduates with the words that had guided his entire life: stay hungry, stay foolish. In August 2011, his body failing, Jobs resigned as CEO of Apple. On October 5, 2011, he died at the age of 56, surrounded by his family. The world mourned a man who had been fired from his own company, written off as finished, and who had returned to build the most valuable enterprise on the planet. In 2018, Apple became the first American company to reach a $1 trillion valuation, and later soared far beyond it. The lesson of Steve Jobs is not simply about technology or wealth. It is about vision, resilience, and the refusal to surrender, even after public humiliation and devastating loss. He took $1,000 gamble in a garage, lost everything, clawed his way back, and changed the world. His own words remain the truest summary of his life. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition.